So there are many different approaches to harmonization that I think Alden will talk to us a little bit about. But regardless of the approach that we use, the first and critical step is pre-statistical harmonization. So pre-statistical harmonization is a critical, time-consuming, laborious, qualitative component of the harmonization project. So once we have a research question and we've determined that we want to use harmonization for that, the first step is to identify data sets that we think will be relevant to our question. We might want to think about the individual study characteristics, like how individuals were recruited into the studies, inclusion, exclusion criteria, et cetera, to make sure that they align well and make sense with our research question. We then want to look at the variables of interest, and of course the focus here is on cognitive variables. So the first step is to see what cognitive instruments were given in each data set. And this is actually pretty challenging given just the sheer number of cognitive instruments that exist in our field. There are several hundreds of them, and they're probably proliferating as we speak here. So our instruments vary along many different dimensions, right? So they vary in terms of the cognitive domain being assessed. So we might have, one test being a global cognitive screening instrument like the ŁMCA. We might have another test that specifically focuses on something like language or visual spatial processing or abstract reasoning, et cetera. And so tests assessing different domains may or may not be relevant to our research question, and they may or may not align well across different data sets. So that's an important thing to think about and look at when we're first taking stock of what data we have. Our tests also vary with regard to measurement precision. So things like its reliability within a particular setting and population, and its ability to provide meaningful information across the spectrum of cognitive ability. For research questions pertaining to longitudinal analyses, we want to think about whether our tests are sensitive to change over time, how sensitive they are to practice effects, et cetera, and there can be a lot of variability across tests with regard to that. We also want to think about the test sensitivity to demographic factors such as age. So we know, for example, that some tests decline with a healthy aging process, whereas others may remain stable or even improve with increased age. If we're thinking about combining data cross-culturally, this is particularly challenging. We want to think about whether the tests that we're using are similarly relevant and meaningful across linguistic or cultural groups. Okay. So once we've looked at what tests we have, we then want to look at what information is gathered in each data set for each particular test. So we have a lot of variability here as well. So some of our tests may just generate a single score, like the animal naming test, total number correct. Other tests may generate a number of subscores. So for example, the California Verbal Learning Test, I counted, we've got 74 different scores and subscores for that particular test, and even double that when we think about both raw and demographically corrected scores. And a particular study may choose to record a specific subset of those subscores depending on what their research goals are. All right, so another thing to think about is some of our tests can be decomposed into multiple items. So for example, the ŁMCA, the Mini Mental State Examination, we have each 30 different items. And studies may choose to record that item level data, or they may choose to just record the subscores or total scores. When we're thinking about the types of scores as well, I mentioned, some studies may record just raw scores, others may report demographically corrected scores in some way, and if they do that, we want to think about the source of normative data that they used and whether those align well across data sets. All right, so to get to this goal here of identifying potentially equivalent scores and variables across studies, we have to do a pretty deep dive. Okay, so there's another layer here that is not talked about quite as much, but I think is really important to think about when we're combining data. So even across seemingly equivalent cognitive tests, there can be other sources of variability. So for example, many of our most widely used cognitive instruments are updated periodically by the test publisher. And there can be tweaks made to the structure that can have an important impact on the meaning of the test scores. So as an example, one of our most widely used cognitive instruments, the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, was originally published in the 50s, and it had updates in the 80s and the 90s, most recently, I believe, in 2008. And so, especially when we're thinking about longitudinal studies that have been going on for a long time, they may have begun with an earlier version of the test and maintained it for consistency. In addition to test version, we want to look at some studies will adapt a standardized test for their specific study goals. They may choose to administer an abbreviated set of items or adjust the standardized procedures in other ways to meet the needs of their population or their study goals. There can be other administration procedures that can vary across studies, such as the circumstances under which a test is discontinued due to inability to complete it. So differences in discontinuation rules can impact the range of scores across data sets. So when we get down to looking at the test scores that are available in the items, another source of potential variability across seemingly equivalent tests is the scoring procedures that are used. So studies may adapt differentially lenient or stringent scoring criteria, again, based on their specific study needs. There may also be just differences in response coding, so the code that's used for a correct or incorrect response, and it's really important to capture all of that information. All right, so with all of that in mind, I wanted to share kind of how we went about this for this project that we're working on. So the BP COG study is led by Deb Levine at the University of Michigan, who I believe is actually a former participant in this workshop. And I think that this idea came from collaborations that she developed here. So it's kind of cool. So the goal of this project is to look at associations between blood pressure over the life course and racial and ethnic disparities in cognitive decline. And so in order to accomplish this, we sought to harmonize cognitive data across 6 longitudinal cohort studies. They're listed here. So here are the steps that we took. So again, we first identified and categorized the cognitive instruments into their specific domains. And in order to get all of this rich procedural information about how the tests were implemented, we contacted cohort study investigators. And we requested their unpublished administration, scoring, procedural details, the test forms that they used, any instructions to the interviewers, et cetera. And then we spent quite a bit of time going into the details for each test. So this is what we extracted. So we looked at the published test version. We looked at any study-specific test adaptations that were done. We looked at the scores and items available for each instrument, any details regarding coding procedures, and then we recorded the possible minimum and maximum raw scores based on the instrument structure and the procedures for each test. And then finally, we looked at the actual data across each study to look at the score ranges and distributions. All right, so this is obviously way too much to take in, but I just wanted to give an example of how we documented all of this. So this is documenting the item level data that we looked at for a number of our screening instruments. So you can see we made note of the study, the test, the item, notes on the coding procedures, and then any additional notes on how they scored or administered the item. All right. So turning to results, this was our first step here where we identified each of the instruments that were given across studies and categorized them into their domains. And then from a bird's eye view, we looked at how much overlap was there or how many common instruments were given across studies. And the ones that we flagged initially as potentially linkable are highlighted here in orange. And you can see, on first glance, things are looking pretty good. It looks like there's a lot of overlap, a lot of equivalent tests being given across studies. But when we did our deeper dive, this is a truncated version of the table. It goes on for probably 30 pages or so. But just to give an example, once we did our deep dive, we found many, many sources of variability across the studies. So we found many differences in the test version. And I'll go through an example in a moment of that. We saw differences in the summary scores that were provided. And again, I'll go through an example of that in a moment. We also saw differences in test adaptation. So for example, 2 cohorts gave the California Verbal Learning Test, and each of them gave an adapted version of that test for their specific study needs. And that really became clear when we were able to look at the unpublished documentation. All right, so I wanted to go through an example here of a test for which different test versions had an impact on how we interpreted the scores. So just to orient you, this is the digit symbol kind of family of tests. It goes by many different names. Respondents are given a key at the top with a series of numbers, and then there are a series of symbols that go below it. And then they're given a series of boxes below, and they have to fill in the symbols that go with the numbers. The main thing that we're extracting is how many they complete within a time limit. So people that perform better get more items within the time limit. This is a measure of attention, processing speed, visual scanning, working memory, kind of depending on who you ask. Let's see. Okay, so when we looked at this data across cohorts, we found that the ERIC and the CHS study gave the WAIS-R version, and CARDIA and MESA gave the WAIS-3 version. So an important change that was made between the WAIS-R and the WAIS-3 was that in the WAIS-R, they're given 90 seconds to complete the task, whereas in the updated version, they get 120 seconds. And along with that, they increased the number of possible items. So the maximum score on the WAIS-3 version is higher than the maximum possible raw score for the WAIS-R version. So when we think about what that means, so an equivalent raw score, so for example, a raw score of 50, if they do that within 90 seconds, they're completing about 0.56 items per second. Whereas if they complete that same number within 120 seconds, they're working quite a bit more slowly. And this is precisely what we're trying to extract from the test. So it's really important that we can account for that. Oh, sorry. And then I just want to also make note, the NOMAS study used a similar test that's different in that in this key here, it's flipped. So the symbols are at the top, the numbers are at the bottom, and they're filling in the numbers that go with the symbols. And so this tends to have a high correlation with the digit symbol test, but scores tend to be a little bit lower, possibly because of the differences in search strategy that's required. And you could see along with that when we looked at the data that is potentially consistent for the NOMAS study. Okay. So having all of that information was really helpful when we looked at the actual distributions across the studies. So again, you can see here the CARDIA and MESA with the WAIS-3 version looked quite a bit different in their distributions and ranges than the ERIC and CHS, which used the WAIS-R version, and from the NOMAS, which used the SDMT. All right. So I'll walk through another example here. This is the digit span test. If anyone's not familiar, the respondent is given a series of digits, and they have to repeat them back first verbatim, forwards order, and then the second subtest backwards. And so they're first given a few digits, and then it gets increasingly higher number of digits until they're not able to do it. The ERIC study only gave the backwards version, so that's what I'll present here. So we had four cohorts that gave the digit span and 4 different versions of the digit span test. So what I extracted for this one is the number of strings of digits that they were exposed to across the different test versions. And interestingly, the WIMS-R, they had a maximum of 7, whereas even the WAIS-R was different. They had up to 8 digits. And so, of course, given that difference in structure, there are differences in the potential maximum score that they can achieve. We also looked at the scores that were available across each cohort. We had the total score for 3 of the 4 cohorts, but for the FOS study, we only had access to the maximum string of digits that they remembered. And so, of course, that's going to have a big impact on the meaning of the score. All right. So again, all of this detail is really helpful when we're looking at the data and trying to understand how they look across the different cohorts. You can see, of course, the FOS looks quite a bit different, and the ERIC, the tails are pulled in a little bit. All right, so I wanted to also just briefly talk about some of the item level differences we found across cognitive screening instruments. And so here, again, we found procedural differences. So for example, for the MMSE, 4 studies gave it, 2 administered both world and serial 7s and scored the higher of the 2, whereas the other 2 gave just world backwards. Orientation to season, we found differences in scoring procedures, so how stringent or lenient they are across cohorts, where some got correct within 2 weeks, whereas others were correct within a month. And here we found differences in the response coding. So in CASI, a correct response was coded as a 2, whereas in some of the other studies, correct response was recorded as a 1. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, when we were looking for these differences, we really made a determination on a case-by-case basis whether these procedural differences were meaningful or not when we thought about the data. And so the 2 examples I just gave, of course, they were clearly different and important to take into account. But other times, after we looked at it in some more detail, we decided, they're not meaningful enough to really worry about. And so I just wanted to give an example of that. So this is the orientation to place, given across several different studies. Sometimes they were given multiple choice. They were asked, are you in a clinic, store, or home? Other times they were asked the address where they were, or just to name the building or the name of the hospital. So this is one that I flagged initially. I was concerned about potential differences in the level of difficulty of this item. And of course, it was asked in a different way across the cohort. So Alden and I looked at this, and when we looked at the frequency of an incorrect response, the frequency was very low overall, and it was similarly low across the cohorts. So after we looked at this, we decided, all right, well, it's a little bit, different in terms of the administration, but it's not meaningful enough to really worry about. And so, sometimes there's a balance, right, between deciding whether to lump or whether to split. Sometimes it was really clear and easy, but other times it was a little bit more difficult, and it's really just a balance of determining how comfortable we are with these minor differences across studies. All right, so to summarize here, pre-statistical harmonization, it's necessary time investment. It is really tedious, and there's a lot of minutia to go through. But it's really rewarding, I think, when we can detect these differences across seemingly equivalent tests. Because if we didn't account for them and notice them, then we'd be getting systematic unmeasured variance by cohort that's not related to the underlying cognitive ability that we're interested in. So the next question is, well, how do we account for these differences? And for that, I'll leave you to your preferred statistical harmonization expert.
We have a tradition of standing ovations.
Oh.